In 1995, every Kakapo left alive on Earth could have fit inside a single room. 51 birds. A flightless moss green parrot that walks instead of flies and breeds only a few times each decade. That was the entire species. New Zealand made a desperate decision. They gathered the last survivors and carried them by boat and by helicopter to remote islands swept clean of predators. No one knew if it would be enough. 31 years later, something happened that no one dared predict. To understand what came back, you first have to understand what was lost. The Kakapo is unlike any other parrot on the planet. It cannot fly. It is the heaviest parrot in the world, with some males tipping the scales at nearly 4 kilograms. It is nocturnal, moving through the forest at night on strong legs, climbing high into the trees with its beak and claws, then parachuting back down to the ground with its useless wings spread wide. It can live for an astonishingly long time, perhaps as long as 90 years, which means a single Kakapo alive today may have hatched before your grandparents were born. And it carries a faint, sweet smell, something like old honey or the inside of an old violin case, a scent that once helped these birds find one another in the dark. For millions of years, this strange green bird thrived across New Zealand. It had no need to fly because there was nothing it needed to flee. New Zealand had almost no land mammals that hunted on the ground. The forests belonged to the birds. The Kakapo evolved in a world without teeth and claws, and so it never learned to fear them. When a Kakapo is frightened, it does the one thing that will not help. It freezes. It holds perfectly still and trusts its mottled feathers to hide it. Against a hawk circling overhead, that instinct saved its life for 1,000 generations. Against what came next, it became a death sentence. The first blow landed roughly 700 years ago, when the first Polynesian settlers arrived. They found the Kakapo easy to catch. They ate its meat and wove its soft feathers into cloaks. And they did not come alone. With them came the Polynesian dog and the Pacific rat, two hunters the Kakapo had no defense against. By the time European settlers arrived in the early 1800s, the bird that had once lived across the entire country had already been pushed back into the central North Island and the deep forests of the south. Then it grew worse. European settlement cleared vast areas of forest, introduced possums and deer, stripped the remaining woods of food, and the settlers brought a new wave of predators that would prove the most devastating of all. Cats, stoats, 2 more species of rat. For a bird that answers danger by freezing in place, these animals were unstoppable. A stoat could walk straight up to a nesting female in the dark, and she would do nothing at all to save herself. By the late 1800s, people began to notice that the Kakapo was vanishing. One of the first to truly understand what was happening was a man named Richard Henry. In 1894, more than 130 years ago, the New Zealand government launched its very first attempt to save the species, and Richard Henry led it. His plan was far ahead of its time. He would move the birds to an island the predators could not reach. He chose Resolution Island in Fiordland, and over several years he caught and carried several hundred Kakapo across the water by hand, one boatload at a time. It was one of the earliest organized wildlife rescues anywhere in the world, and then he watched it fail. Stoats, it turned out, are strong swimmers. Within about 6 years, they reached Resolution Island on their own, and one by one, they destroyed the population Richard Henry had given so much to build. He had done everything right. The ocean simply was not wide enough. By the middle of the 20th century, the Kakapo was considered all but gone. Few people ever saw one. No one was caring for them. A handful of birds clung on in the most remote corners of the country, and most of the world quietly assumed the species was already finished. But it was not quite. Between 1949 and 1973, a newly formed wildlife service mounted more than 60 expeditions into the wilderness, searching for any Kakapo that might still survive. They focused on Fiordland, the rugged, rain-soaked southwest. Across all those years and all those expeditions, they found just 6 birds. Every single one was male. All but one died within months. A species cannot rebuild itself from males alone. It seemed the Kakapo had become a kind of ghost, a bird that existed only as scattered, lonely males booming into an empty forest, calling for females that would never come. Then, in 1975, high in the mountains of Fiordland, more than 1,000 meters above the sea, searchers found another male. They named him Richard Henry, after the man who had tried to save the species 80 years before. This bird mattered far more than anyone realized at the time. He was the last known survivor of the entire Fiordland population, the final keeper of a unique and ancient bloodline. He boomed in his own dialect, unlike any other Kakapo. His feathers were a brighter green, marked with bold yellow. He was, in a sense, the last of his kind within the last of his kind. And still, he was male. The species needed females. Without them, Richard Henry was simply a beautiful ending to a very long story. The breakthrough came not from Fiordland, but from an island in the far south called Stewart Island, known to Maori as Rakura. In 1977, searchers heard something they had almost stopped hoping for: the deep, resonant boom of male Kakapo, not one or two, but many, rolling through the night. There were around 200 birds living there, on an island where stoats and ferrets had never set foot. And in 1980 came the discovery everyone had waited decades for. Among them were females. For the first time in a century, the Kakapo had a future. But that future was already under attack. Feral cats had found the Rakura birds, and they were killing them quickly. The very population that had given everyone hope was collapsing in real time. Conservationists faced an agonizing choice: leave the birds where they were and watch the cats finish them, or gather up every survivor they could find and move them somewhere safer. They chose to move them. Over 17 years, from 1980 to 1997, teams combed the forests of Rakura and carried the survivors out one bird at a time to predator-free island sanctuaries: Codfish Island, known as Wenuahu, Maud Island, and Little Barrier Island, called Te Hauturu o Toi. The few remaining Fiordland males, including the precious Richard Henry, were moved as well. It was the same idea Richard Henry the man had tried a century earlier, only this time the islands were chosen with far greater care and cleared of predators with far greater thoroughness. But moving the birds did not solve everything. Even safe from cats and stoats, the Kakapo still struggled to breed. And on the islands, a familiar enemy was waiting. Rats. Pacific rats had reached some of the sanctuaries, and they did what rats do. They found the nests in the dark. They killed the newly hatched chicks. Between the painfully slow breeding and the hungry rats, the Kakapo could not produce enough young to replace the adults that were dying. By 1995, the arithmetic had become terrifying. Across more than 15 years of effort, only a handful of chicks had survived to adulthood. The entire species had been ground down to 51 birds, 31 males, 20 females, just 20 breeding-age females standing between the Kakapo and the end. It was the lowest point in the bird's long history, and it forced a brutal question. Everything they had tried had slowed the decline, but nothing had reversed it. If they kept doing what they were doing, the Kakapo would simply fade out, one funeral at a time. So they changed everything. New Zealand launched a complete overhaul of how the species would be managed, and it became one of the most intensive, hands-on conservation programs the world had ever seen. From that moment, every single Kakapo would be known by name. Every bird would be tracked, and the people who ran the program made a quiet promise to a parrot that could not fly. "We will not let you disappear." That promise ran straight into a mystery that had baffled scientists for decades. The Kakapo simply would not breed on demand. Most birds breed every year. The Kakapo does not. It breeds only once every 2 to 4 years, and for a long time, no one understood why. The answer turned out to be one of the strangest courtship rituals in the natural world. The Kakapo is the only parrot on Earth that breeds in what scientists call a lek. In the spring of a breeding year, the males climb to the high points of the island and dig out shallow bowls in the earth, linked together by networks of carefully cleared tracks. Then, night after night, sometimes for weeks or even months without rest, each male inflates his body like a balloon and produces a deep, booming call that rolls out across the island. The booms can carry for kilometers. Females hear them in the darkness and walk, sometimes for hours, across the island to choose a mate. After mating, the male's work is finished. The female does everything alone. She builds the nest, she lays the eggs, and she raises the chicks entirely by herself. But here was the puzzle that drove scientists to distraction. The males did not boom every year. The females did not come every year. The Kakapo would go season after season without breeding at all, and then, in certain years, the whole island would suddenly erupt in courtship. What was the trigger? The answer was a tree, the Rimu. The Rimu is a tall native conifer, and every few years it produces a heavy crop of small fruit, an event scientists call a mast. For decades, conservationists had noticed that the Kakapo bred in the very same years the Rimu fruited heavily. They could see the link plainly, they simply could not explain it. Why would a bird tie the entire future of its species to the fruiting of a single tree? They tried to outsmart it. In years when the Rimu did not fruit, they offered the birds extra food, hoping to spark breeding anyway. It almost never worked. The Kakapo waited for the Rimu, and nothing else would do. Then, in 2015, researchers at Massey University found the missing piece. They discovered that Rimu fruit is unusually rich in two things a breeding bird desperately needs: calcium and vitamin D. Calcium for building eggshells and growing the bones of chicks, and vitamin D, which the body must have in order to use that calcium at all. This was a genuine shock, because scientists had long believed there were almost no natural foods with high levels of vitamin D. But think about the Kakapo. It is nocturnal and flightless, living its entire life in the shade of the forest floor with very little sunlight. It could not make vitamin D the way most animals do by basking in the sun. So over millions of years, it had found another way. It got its vitamin D from a tree. The Rimu fruit was not just a meal, it was a perfect, natural prenatal supplement delivered by the forest itself in exactly the years the tree could afford to feed a new generation of chicks. The Kakapo had never been stubborn. It had been waiting patiently for the one food that made healthy eggs possible. Once scientists finally understood this, they could work with the bird's biology instead of fighting against it, timing their entire effort around the slow, ancient rhythm of the Rimu. And they brought to that effort everything modern science had to offer. Today, every Kakapo alive wears a small backpack, a radio transmitter that lets rangers follow its movements and even know the moment it has mated. During the breeding season, eggs are sometimes lifted gently from the nest and placed in incubators to give them the very best chance, while clever fakes, smart eggs fitted with sensors, are slipped beneath the mother so she keeps doing her job and never notices the difference. Some birds are helped along with artificial insemination. Chicks too weak to survive on their own are hand-reared and later returned to the wild. This is, without exaggeration, one of the most carefully watched over wild animals on the entire planet. A few of these birds even became famous. One male named Sirocco was hand-reared after falling ill as a chick, and he grew up convinced he was rather more human than parrot. Years later, while a wildlife documentary was being filmed, Sirocco climbed onto the head of a very startled presenter in front of the cameras, and the clip traveled around the world. New Zealand responded by making him an official spokesbird for conservation. A single, charming parrot did more to make ordinary people care about his species than any statistic ever could. By the late 2010s, It was working. The booms were returning, the chicks were surviving. The population was climbing back, slowly, painfully, but climbing. And then, in 2019, during one of the most successful breeding seasons the program had ever seen, disaster struck from a direction no one had braced for. It was not a cat, it was not a stoat or a rat. It was a fungus. A respiratory disease called aspergillosis swept through the birds on Wenuahau. The very thing that had kept the Kakapo alive, crowding the whole species onto a few small, guarded islands, now turned a single outbreak into a potential catastrophe. 21 birds fell ill. 9 of them died, among them nesting females and young chicks, the very future the team had fought so hard to create. In a matter of weeks, the population dropped to just 211. What happened next revealed exactly how far people were now willing to go. In an extraordinary rescue, the highest-risk birds were rushed off the island and flown to veterinary hospitals on the mainland. More than 50 Kakapo were transported. Dozens were given full body scans, the very same kind a human patient receives, so that vets could find the infection hiding deep in their lungs. Teams worked around the clock to save birds that, only 30 years earlier, the world had written off as good as extinct. It was heartbreaking. It was also a measure of how much had changed. A species that had once been slipping away with almost no one watching was now being fought for, one parrot at a time, by an entire nation. They held the line. The Kakapo survived the outbreak, and by 2022, the population reached a new high of 252 birds, the most there had been in half a century. The long, slow climb was real, but the biggest moment was still ahead of them. Remember those 51 birds carried to remote islands in 1995? 31 years later, in the summer of 2026, the Rimu fruited across the southern islands in extraordinary abundance, the heaviest mast in years, and the Kakapo did exactly what they had been waiting a whole generation to do. They bred. Not a few of them, almost all of them. It began with a single chick. Early in the season, on Anchor Island, a tiny Kakapo chick named Tiwiri became the first of its kind to hatch in 4 long years. It was not the last. Behind it came another, and another, and another. Across the breeding islands, 80 nests filled with eggs, more than 250 of them in all. Every Friday, the rangers updated the running tally in marker pen on the door of the refrigerator at their field base, and watched the numbers climb, week after week, almost unable to believe what they were seeing. By the time the season was finished, the Kakapo had produced at least 95 chicks. 95. It was, by a wide margin, the largest breeding season in the entire history of the recovery program, shattering every record that came before it. A species that had been reduced to 51 survivors. A species that only 3 decades earlier could have fit inside a single room, had just welcomed one of the largest generations it had seen in living memory. The booming that had so nearly fallen silent forever was now answered, across island after island, by the soft begging calls of more young Kakapo than anyone had heard in a lifetime. And the people who saved them are already turning toward the next chapter. The goal now is no longer simply bigger numbers. It is freedom. With every successful season, the team is deliberately stepping back, doing a little less by hand, letting the Kakapo learn to be wild again. They dream of a day when these birds no longer need backpacks and incubators and human nurses. A day when there are simply enough of them and enough safe land that a Kakapo can go back to being nothing more and nothing less than a Kakapo. They even dream of returning the bird to the mainland one day, so that some quiet night somewhere out in the New Zealand bush, an ordinary person might hear a deep, ancient boom roll out of the dark and understand that the strangest parrot in the world had finally found its way home. The Kakapos spent 700 years learning how to disappear. And then, against every reasonable expectation, with the help of a few stubborn humans and one remarkable tree, it remembered how to come back.